Hi there, Alex here at mixinglessons.com. In today's video, we're going to have a look at the VCA compressor by Softube. So I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction to this compressor. We'll have a look at some of the different parameters. We'll have a listen to some sound examples, and I'm going to give you a bit of a general overview. And something to mention before we get started is that until the end of this month, Softube are offering this compressor completely for free. So I'll leave a link in the description for you to go and get your free download of this compression plugin for the rest of this month. Now, before we start to have a look at this compressor, if you're somebody who's learning about compression and you want to learn how you can do different things with compression, like make tracks sound more punchy, make tracks sound fatter, achieve level balance, or you want to know what the different settings on a compressor do, whether it be the threshold, the ratio, the attack, the release, and so on, I've got a free guide that I'd like to offer you, and it's my free compression cheat sheet. You can get that at mixinglessons.com/free-downloads, and when you download that, it will also come bundled with a free EQ cheat sheet and a free vocal recording guide to give you a bit of a head start with your recording and mixing. Okay, so let's start off by having a look at some of the parameters that we have on this VCA compressor. Okay, so we'll start off in this section here. So these are your basic controls that you would associate with most compressors. We have one simply labeled compression, the ratio, the attack, and the release. So with most compressors, we might be a little bit more used to having threshold, ratio, attack, release, or maybe an input parameter. And when you have an input parameter, generally you have what's known as a fixed threshold. Very briefly, the threshold sets the point at which anything that gets louder than this should be turned down by the compressor. So often you will have a threshold setting and you can set exactly where you want to say anything that goes louder than this, the compressor should turn it down. Sometimes you have an input setting and the threshold is fixed, and the way you determine how much the signal is going over the threshold is by increasing the input, sending more signal into the compressor, and in turn increasing how much the signal is going above that threshold. Now, the way that this compression control works is it's kind of a little bit of a cross between the two. It kind of works as an input control, and it also kind of works as a threshold control. So it sort of does the same job as the threshold, but rather than thinking about things in terms of where you're setting a threshold or how much you're pushing the signal past the threshold, you can simply think of this exactly the way it's labeled, as applying less or more compression to the signal. And something that's quite nice about this parameter is it has these below and above LEDs. So let's send some signal into this compressor and let's see that in action. So those LEDs are letting us know which parts of the signal the compression is being applied to. Okay, the next parameter is the ratio. Now, very briefly, the way a ratio works on a compressor is if you have it set at 4:1, what that means is that for every 4 decibels that the signal gets louder than the threshold, the signal is going to be turned down, it's going to be compressed so that it actually only gets 1 decibel louder than the threshold. So if it went 8 decibels over the threshold, it would actually come out of the compressor only 2 decibels louder than the threshold. If you were to set the ratio at 3:1, for every 3 decibels that the signal goes over the threshold, it only gets 1 decibel louder than the threshold. And so this parameter allows you to determine how much the signal is compressed, how much the signal is turned down by. And then you have the attack and release settings, and so this controls how quickly the signal will be turned down, and this controls how quickly the compression will subside and how quickly or gradually the signal will rise back up to its original level. So those are the kind of common parameters that you would find on a compressor. We also have an input meter, which shows us the level of the signal that's coming into the compressor, and then we have a gain reduction meter. So this shows us how much the signal is being turned down by the compressor. We also have an output control, so that controls how loud the signal comes out of the compressor once it has been compressed. And so you're probably quite used to having those parameters and those types of meters on compression plugins. Let's have a look now at some of the things that are maybe a little bit more unique to this plugin, and let's start to have a listen to some examples. So the first is this high frequency makeup parameter. Now, something that you might have noticed when you use compression is that naturally it can make things sound a little bit less bright. It can make things sound a little bit more dull, perhaps. And so what this parameter aims to do is it aims to compensate for this by using slightly lower ratios on the higher frequencies in order to compensate for the high frequency loss that you sometimes get with compression. So let's send some signal into this compressor and let's have a play around with this. So I'm going to use a fast attack and release, and what I'm aiming to do by doing that is to sort of tame the transients a little bit, bring down the level of the kick and the snare, and in turn sort of raise the level of the ambience or the sustain of the drums. So we'll start with the drums running through the compressor with the high frequency makeup turned off, and then we'll turn it on. So it's definitely a little brighter with the HF makeup switched on. Listen particularly to the brightness of the snare drum and also a little bit of the hi-hat. We'll start once again with it turned off. So you can hear there that the snare drum and the hi-hat are brighter with the high frequency makeup turned on. So that could be quite a useful little tool to have access to on your compressor. Now the next parameter that we have here is a stereo link option. So that gives you the option to either run this as a stereo compressor or a dual mono compressor. So if we select the linked option, what that means is the compressor will apply the same amount of compression to the left and the right channel, even if one of the sides is triggering less compression than the other. Whereas if you have it unlinked and you're running it as dual mono, that means that the compressor compresses the left and the right sides independently. And so that could be a useful option to have depending on what it is that you're compressing. Now the next thing we have control over is this sidechain section. And this gives us a few different options. So the first is this punch option in the sidechain. So first of all, what is the sidechain? Well, the sidechain is the version of the signal that the compressor is listening to decide when it's going to apply compression. So the compressor doesn't actually listen to the same version of the signal that we're listening to when we press play. The compressor actually has its own version of the signal that it listens to. And you can make certain alterations to that signal to make the compressor do different things. So here, this punch option adds a low cut and a high boost EQ to the version of the signal that the compressor's listening to. So it's not the version of the signal that we can hear, it's only the version of the signal that the compressor hears. Now what that means is that by altering the frequencies of the version that the compressor hears, by taking away some of the lows and boosting the highs, it makes the compressor a little less responsive to the low end and a little more responsive to the high end. And in turn, the theory is that this will give us a punchier sound. So once again, let's apply some compression and let's see how this sounds. This time, I want to set the compressor up so that it gives those transients the opportunity to pass through with not so much compression applied. So by using a slower attack and release time, I'm actually aiming for a punchier sound to begin with. And then we'll experiment with toggling this punch setting on and off. So I would agree that that adds a little bit of punch to the sound. I think that it's most noticeable with the kick drum. With this option selected, the kick drum sounds a little bit punchier, and without this option selected, it maybe sounds a little bit flatter. Okay, the next parameter that this compressor gives us is a sidechain filter. And so once again, this will alter the version of the signal that the compressor is listening to. And so what this does is this makes the compressor a little bit less sensitive to the frequencies below whatever you set this parameter to. So something to be aware of with compression is that it responds more to low frequency sounds. And so what you can find is that sometimes whatever's going on in the low end can be triggering a lot of compression. And obviously that compression is then applied to the entire frequency spectrum of the signal that you're applying the compression to. So sometimes we want to make the compressor a little bit less responsive to some of the things that are going on in the low end. And so you can do that using this parameter. So again, that's a useful parameter to have access to on a compressor. And then we also have control over the external sidechain. So far it's been the case that the compressor is listening to a copy of the signal that we are applying compression to. But something you can do with a compressor is that you could have this compressor listening to an entirely different signal. It doesn't have to just be a copy of the signal that you're applying the compression to. So let's say you added this compression plugin to a bass guitar track. If you wanted to, you could have the compression that's being applied to that bass guitar track being triggered by an entirely different track in your mix. So something that's quite common is to have the kick drum trigger the compression on the bass guitar track. So each time the kick drum plays, compression is applied to the bass guitar. So let's say we've added this plugin to a bass guitar track. We would assign the track that we want to have triggering the compression to this compressor's sidechain. And so this lets you control the incoming level of the signal that the compressor is listening to when you're having the compressor listen to a different track in your mix to decide when it's going to apply compression. Okay, now there are a couple more parameters to look at. Here we have what's known as output drive. And so this allows you to drive the signal a little harder. And so actually you can achieve a little bit of distortion by driving this signal a little harder. So let's have a listen to that. And so as you can hear, that gives you the opportunity to drive the signal a little bit harder and to achieve a little bit of distortion from this compressor. And so that's creating quite a unique and quite an interesting effect from this drum track. And that could be something that you may want to have in your mix. Obviously, it's something that you would probably want to use in controlled amounts. But I think that this is something that can sound pretty good on drums, and it's something that can also work really nicely on bass guitar. And so again, this is a nice little feature to have on this plugin to play around with. Okay, and next we have a dry-wet control. So the dry setting would be the signal without any compression, and then the wet signal would be the compressed version of this signal. And so what this allows you to do is it allows you to dial in a sort of balance between the dry signal and the compressed signal. So let's experiment with maybe overdoing the compression a little bit here, maybe to the point where it makes an interesting effect, but it's perhaps too much for the context of most mixes. And then let's find a balance between the dry and wet signal to maybe make it something that would maybe fit into your mix a little bit better. Okay, and so you can hear there that what that allowed me to do was sort of overcompress things a little bit, more as a sort of an effect, but then to dial it back a little bit by finding a more appropriate blend between the compressed signal and the uncompressed signal. And so in general, I think this is a really, really nice plugin. I think it sounds really nice, it's really easy to use. And in addition to these main parameters that we've looked at so far, this compressor does actually have a few more, shall we say, advanced parameters that we'll just take a brief look at. So if you click on these three icons at the top, you can open up some more parameters and some more settings. So here you have control and some metering for the input. Here you have the same for the output. And then you have some more controls along the bottom. So let's briefly just look at these. So here you can control the level of the input. And then you also have various meters, and you can choose what these meters are over here. So at the minute it's set to peak and RMS, so you have 2 meters here. But you could change these, if you wanted to true peak or to LUFS, and you can choose which kinds of LUFS values you have for your LUFS meter. Same for the output. At the minute we have it set to peak and RMS, but you could also set this to true peak and LUFS if you wanted to. So it's quite versatile. You can use different meters depending on what it is that you're doing with this compressor. You can also set a target LUFS value if you want to. There's also a gain difference meter, so this tells you the difference in the perceived level of the signal that's going into and coming out of the compressor. And so some of these meters could be very useful to you depending on what it is that you use this compressor for. You're also able to invert the phase of the signal, and so anything below whatever frequency you set this to will be phase inverted. You can apply a high-pass filter to the signal that's going into the compressor, and you can also control how much headroom the compressor has. So if you were to decrease the amount of headroom that the compressor has, then you will achieve more compression from the compressor, and you will get more distortion with this drive setting. And you can also have different settings for the compressor set up on these tabs here. So for example, you could have one compression setting with a fast attack and a fast release, and then you could create a second one with a slower attack and a slower release, and you can A/B between them. So some of the parameters that are in here maybe won't be used to some people. Maybe you will prefer to stick to what's going on in the main compression window. Perhaps you won't even make use of some of the sidechain filters, for example, and you'll just use this as a nice simple compressor where you can control how much compression you're applying, the ratio to determine how much signals are being turned down, and use the attack and the release, and of course the output, just as you would with any other compressor. So it can be a fairly simple compressor that sounds really good and is nice and easy to use. But if you want to, you can get into these sidechain controls, you can apply some distortion, you have more advanced metering options, you can invert the phase if you need to, you can change the headroom of the plugin if these things are useful to you. So I really like this plugin. I think it sounds really good, I think it's really nice and easy to use, but if you do need some of those advanced features, those are there as well. So I would highly recommend checking it out. As I say, this is available for free until the end of this month. And if you don't have a compressor that offers you some of these features, then I think it's definitely worth adding to your collection. So that's just a bit of an overview and an introduction to the VCA compressor by Softube. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you found it interesting. Don't forget to get that free compression cheat sheet from mixinglessons.com/free-downloads. The link to that is in the description. And that also comes with the EQ cheat sheet and the vocal recording guide bundled in as well. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.